Vohra. He is the co-founder of AP Homeschool Project, the founder of the Vohra Method, and internationally published author of The Equation for Excellence: How to Make Your Child Excel at Math. He has helped students all over the country academically dominate their private, magnet, public, and boarding schools and get 1,500 plus SAT scores. Now he'd like to show you how to get ahead of those elite students and use homeschooling to create a supercharged college prep program.
Thank you so much for having me on. I mean, it's an honor to be included in the first, as far as I know, Taxation is Theft Fest, certainly the biggest Taxation is Theft Fest so far. And when we start to think about taxation being theft, it's hard to ignore the biggest source of local taxation, state level taxation of all, which is public schools. And the concern that so many of us have is that if we stop using public schools, either collectively or individually, we would be at an academic disadvantage, that our kids would suffer, even though it might be the politically right thing, the personally right thing to do. We don't want that to happen. So this presentation is about how to make sure that your homeschooling program is so far, so massively, so unstoppably dominant compared to anything you can get at a public school, at a magnet school, at a private school, at a boarding school, that no one at any public school or magnet school or private school will ever be able to catch up. Essentially, what I'm talking about is the educational equivalent of a Manhattan Project. Excuse me, a couple of a bit of allergies, not Corona, I think. And so I want to start with this idea of where this all comes from. Why would I even know how to do this? My company, Vohra Method, we work with students at the best private magnet boarding schools in the world, ranging from highly competitive magnet schools like Stuyvesant, which are free and very academically competitive, to schools like La Rosie that cost over $100,000 a year. And we have our students dominating those schools all day long, to the point that they're often several grades ahead of their peers in those schools. And I'm going to show you how to get past that, how to get past the highest, most elite level that currently exists, and not by just a little bit, by a huge, dramatic, insane level. I want to start by talking about the history of public schools in America. Why did public schools even come into existence? And there's two big driving forces that you want to be aware of when you're thinking about public schools. The first driving force was the fact that there was a lot of people coming from different countries. And there was a sense, and by the way, I'm going to give public schools every benefit of the doubt. There was a sense that we needed to have a cohesive American culture, not a culture that was like, part Irish, part Polish, part all these other things, but just a cohesive American culture. And one role of public schools was to correct that. The other role is the interesting one. The other role is what defines everything that happens in public and private schools today. And that second thing is what's going to let you so surpass them that they will not even be able to be close to you. Just as the second that the first nuclear weapon was developed, all other armies became obsolete. Once you fully understand this method of independent schooling, every other type of schooling is going to be obsolete. And here's what that second piece is. It was one of the reasons, one of the many reasons, and you can look up it up historically. The proponents of public schools were arguing for this. The opponents of public schools didn't really bring it up, is that it was a way to reduce child labor. Right there. It was a way to reduce child labor. The purpose was that if you have people who are in school, if kids are in school, they cannot at the exact same time be chimney sweeps. If they're in school, they can't also be working in factories at the same time. Now, if you want to be cynical, you can say that that was a way for unions and labor organizations to get rid of their competition. If you want to be generous, you can say it was a way to protect children. But however you look at it, the goal, one of the goals of public school from the beginning, in its DNA itself, was to use up time. If a public school at the time had some very advanced technology that let it, for example, teach kids calculus in 5 minutes, that wouldn't achieve the goal, right? That wouldn't achieve the goal of using up time, because if you learn calculus in 5 minutes, then you can be a chimney sweep for the other, 7 hours, 55 minutes of a workday. So the reason that this is so important, the reason that it's so important is that if the goal of public schools from the beginning was to waste time, to use up time on purpose, if the goal was to do that, then efficiency was never part of it. It wasn't about how much could you do in as little time as possible, but rather how much could you do in as much time. Excuse me, guys. Yeah, these allergies are getting me today. It's how much could you do in as much time as possible, and the more time you spent, the better. One more second here. All right, here we go. All right, yeah, I'm good. So the more time you spend, the better. Does that make sense? The more time you spend.
I was homeschooled as a kid, and I homeschooled my daughter. And as when I was a kid, my mom started off she transitioned us out of Catholic school. So she started off every morning. She had this schedule where every hour we were supposed to do certain things. And then she'd realize I was doing my work in the first 10 minutes of every hour and then goofing off. So then she started giving me assignments at the beginning of the day. I was done with them in a couple hours, and then I'd goof off. And then it finally got to the point at the beginning of the school year. She'd hand me what she wanted me to know by the end of the year. I'd have it done before Christmas, and then I could go do whatever I wanted. So mostly, I had weird, odd jobs. From when I was about 8, I would, cut grass, cleaned houses and stuff for elderly people, made a little money that way. I got into soccer refereeing, waiting tables, all of that. But it was awesome for me that I knew exactly what was expected of me, and I could just do it as quickly as possible, and then I'd have the rest of my time to do what I wanted. Whereas in my mind, there was one year I was stuck in public school, and it was torture because I'd been homeschooling all those years. And having to spend 7-8 hours of my day just wasting time was brutal because I didn't have time, to have an extra job and to do all that stuff I had been used to having. And I don't understand how anybody can just institutionalize their kid for that long of a day. We don't even do it to adults, adults at least get a full hour break in the middle of the day. Kids don't even get that.
And here's what's interesting about what you're saying is at the beginning, I'm reading between the lines here, but at the beginning, it seems like your mom was kind of maybe a little bit worried that you weren't using up the amount of time that you were supposed to use up. Or
she was trying to model what she had seen in schools her whole life and then just have a better quality curriculum. And it ended up just being one of those, well, this is what you need to know by the end of the year, so go nuts.
Yeah.
And it's not like I didn't learn other things beyond that, but it was just the state mandated minimums of things you have to cover.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting. We see the exact same thing that we see in public school, which is that it's good to waste time. In private school, both by custom and actually by law, private schools have to spend a minimum amount of time to accomplish a task. You would never do that in industry. You would never say, listen, we need you to build the software, but you got to take at least 3 months to do it.
Well, they sort of do. How often do you have a boss in life that says, okay, this is your assignments for the month. This is your project you're doing. Get it done. Versus bosses that say, be here between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, and this is our projects and our deadlines. They are paying you to waste time. If you could finish that project in a week, why shouldn't you have the next 3 weeks of the month off?
Exactly.
But that's not the way our work is. It's about wasting time, because if you waste time, then you have to buy stuff. If you have to buy stuff, we have an economy.
And see that right there, and that's what gives us this opening. The fact if everybody, so imagine for a moment that you're running, say, a software company or any kind of production company, whether you're making cars or shoes or houses or whatever, and let's say everyone else in the world, everyone else in the country at least, has this belief that they need to be slow, right? Everyone else is trying to be slow, right?
You get paid by the hour, not by the job.
Right. That's everyone gets paid by the hour.
Right. That's why I liked cleaning houses and yard work when I was a kid. I wasn't being tied up by the hour. I was being tied up by finishing the job.
Exactly, right.
Have all kinds of customers.
And so that's the amazing thing, right? So if you knew everyone else is doing this totally just backwards thing, it actually wouldn't be so inconceivable to get not just a little bit ahead, but just insanely ahead, because they're doing something that's inherently self-destructive, right?
Right.
So and so that's the opening here, right? That's the opening that this gives us, is that we are able to now ask a different question. So one way to look at this is, all right, here's the stuff you need to do it as quickly as you can. Or here's the stuff you need to do and take the public school model and take as long as you can do it. But there's this other way of looking at it. And we call it, and this is where we've built the idea of what we call the AP Homeschool Project. And it's asking a different question, right? We're saying not just how quickly can I do this stuff or how long can I do this stuff, but if I didn't have these brakes on, right? If I didn't have somebody intentionally trying to waste my time, if I was willing to rethink everything, and this is a big and, right? And I know this and is going to turn off a lot of people. And that's fine. This isn't for everyone. This is for a specific group of people with a specific goal. And your goal was to create a sort of traditional-ish, academically competitive college prep homeschooling program. So in other words, it wouldn't be like, I'm not talking about an unschooling program or a lot of the other programs. Not that I have anything against those. I think they're fantastic. But this is the question that people brought to us. If I want to do a college prep program, if I want to get into Harvard, if I want to have a more standardized test, whatever you want to look at it in the traditional ways, whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But if that's your goal, that's why we developed the AP Homeschool Project. It was basically a way. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, but overwhelmingly, people overestimate how much you need to know to get through college. Like, I did my 9th grade year at public school, convinced my mom to let me homeschool again my 10th grade year, so I could get prepped for college and start college at 16. So I was going through like the entire Great Book series, teaching myself calculus, like thinking college was going to be hard.
Right.
I didn't even crack a textbook most of my undergrad years. Didn't need to. Didn't show up most of my courses because I didn't need to. College was high school all over again. It was a waste of time. It was a joke. It wasn't until I got to grad school that I even had to do assignments to actually, get grades. And it's pathetic.
And see, that's what I'm saying. I mean, and you're totally right. I mean, there's no question that you're right about that. So in a sense, there's a lot of you guys out there who might start a program like an AP Homeschool Project type program or a different program and realize that honestly, you can just take the brakes off and do whatever you want to. But
that's why you see so many homeschoolers that get into college so young. That's why MIT decided to do away with a lot of their diploma and testing requirements. If you had a portfolio or if you had gone on like edX and completed a certain number of courses and gotten certified on them, things like that. They're like, homeschoolers do overwhelmingly well here. We're not going to put the brakes on them just because they don't have paperwork. And people get free rides to MIT that way.
Now, I know a lot of the people who are watching today are libertarians, so I do want to throw this out there. Your chair was also homeschooled, and he went to college early. So this is not just like some crazy stuff we're talking about. Nick Sarwark is an example of this, right? This is not some, not just some stuff that we pay tax on. Right. So let me get into a few of these ideas, right? And I think it's really, I mean, it's really exciting for me to be able to have you over here as well, because that way, I mean, we can talk about both from, because I wasn't homeschooled, right? I went through the traditional route or traditional-ish route. I went to competitive private schools, then from there to college, and the whole time I was like, this is just dumb. There's something wrong with this, and it really came down to me that there's this moment in school. It was in 9th grade for me. Interestingly, while you would have also been stuck in public school, I was stuck in private school, but of course a state-controlled private school like all private schools are. And here's what happened: is this was in a biology class, and it was near toward the second half of the second semester of the year, and the biology teacher told us these two things that together blew my mind. The first is, he says, you guys should take the biology SAT subject test. At the time it was called the biology SAT 2. And the second thing he told all of us, was that also this class isn't really going to prepare you for it. And I was like, well, what the hell have we been doing for the last 6.5 months? Well, what were we? I mean, and so I was like, so at first I thought, maybe there was that the test was just like, some stupid test stuff, and then we'd been doing more academic stuff. So what I did is I took a look. I got some independent study guides, the Barron's SAT biology book, and I looked at it, and it didn't seem like a bunch of stupid standardized test stuff. It seemed like biology. So it happened to be near spring break. I took spring break and I just studied hardcore for a week. And in that week, I'd learned more than I did in the previous 6 or 7 months. So I took another week off. I told my mom I was just not going to school, called sick, say, make some excuse. I don't care. I'm just not going to go. I took another week, and that was enough at the time to get a top 1% score. Today it would have been a perfect score. At the time it was a little bit less because it was many, many, many years ago. And so that's and that was the beginning of this. I mean, that was decades ago, but that's where all of this started. And so in my business, we started thinking about things differently. We started saying, well, what if you turn this around, right? What if we made this just goal-oriented, both for internal goals and external goals? What if we said, all right, what if we go with this model of education that says you need to learn stuff and then you need to prove it to somebody? Which do have certain problems with that model, but let's say we just went with that model. You need to learn some stuff, you need to prove it to somebody. What are some things that you could do? And so from there, we started building and experimenting and thinking of all these different ways. And I know you're going to chime in, so whatever you're ready, definitely let me know.
I was just going to say, like, the tangible application of that. It's not even just being able to take that test and put it back on paper. Mm-hmm. Like, laws of thermodynamics, people understand that the more warm stuff there is around cold stuff, the faster the cold stuff heats to temperature, right? Mm-hmm. Now, ask somebody to boil a pot of water. What do they do almost every time? They fill the pot, stick it on the stove, stick it on the fire, whatever, to boil the pot of water. They don't add an inch, bring it to a boil, add another inch or two, and keep doing it that way, which would boil it in less than half the time. Mm-hmm. How long does the average public school teach basic stuff like that in physical science? Probably a month, 3 weeks. They're going over how that works. Mm-hmm. And they test on it. They test on it again at the end of the year. But when it comes to actually applying that knowledge in real life, it's completely gone. Our school system is a joke for that reason. All they do is they can put information on a piece of paper, but they can't take that information and apply it to life. And that's the big advantage to homeschooling, is you can show how that works in mm-hmm. regular everyday application. And kids in schools never seem to get that opportunity.
Now, theoretically, you could show that in schools. People just don't. Because
the lawyers wouldn't let you. Boiling water around children? Come on.
Yeah,
lawyers get in the way of that.
But the other thing is this, is when you talk to homeschoolers, what do you notice? You notice that they're engaged, right? And when you talk to public school, what do you notice? They're checked out. And they're not just checked out, the teachers are checked out. I mean, if you told me as a teacher that, listen, Arvin, you have to take at least 9 months to teach algebra, I would say no. And if I had no choice, let's say it was like a financial necessity, in just less than a year, I would just be mentally indifferent to what I was doing, because it's such a demeaning and stupid task. The great teachers are going to hate it. The great students are going to hate it. The average teachers and average students are going to hate it. It's idiotic. It's not.
That's why the Montessori type schools have the highest teacher satisfaction ratings of any type of organized school, because it gives the teachers and the kids the most freedom to learn in a way that makes sense to both of them, instead of having to follow the little workbooks along and do everything in a systematic fashion.
And that's true. Although here's the thing that might make you laugh. I was actually at a Montessori school for what I was up until third grade. And there's two things I want to say about Montessori. First, almost every person I met who's gotten, say, above a top 1% SAT score, almost every single one had Montessori training at some point in their lives, and usually at least up till third grade, sometimes a little farther than that. The second thing is, this will show you something about personality, is in Montessori school, you can do a lot of it's pretty unstructured. So you can spend time painting, you can spend time doing math workbooks, you can spend time playing. And I spent a disproportionate amount of time in Montessori school on my own accord doing math workbooks, because that's just what I thought was fun in those days. So it does give you kind of freedom to be a total nerd if you want to. So I want to illustrate something. So people say, well, I love this idea of free education, free market education, being able to explore. I love the idea of my son, my daughter, to be able to explore this. Kids are saying, I would love to have this, but I'm afraid that no one's going to believe me. No one's going to trust the fact that I did all this work. How am I going to prove it? And there's a lot of ways we can prove it just through competence, right? I mean, most of the time at Vohra Method, when we hire people, we don't look at their degrees. We don't care. We don't look at their grades. We don't care. We don't look at their test scores. We have our own internal testing that's much harder than any other testing So it's not, we do care about their ability, but we're not like saying like, oh my God, we need to make sure that you have some degree in something, because who cares? We meet idiots with degrees all the time. Why is that going to matter? So I want to illustrate something to you guys right now that you could do as a homeschooler, and literally no public or private or magnet school will offer it. And I'm going to take it one step further. No private, public, or magnet school will let you do it unless you fight with them a lot and like bring the city council into it if it's public school, or have your parents contact the board of directors and make a whole fuss if it's a private school. The reason I know this is because this is exactly what our students have to do when they want to do half of this, not even the whole thing, just half. So here's where this comes from, right? When we think about what history is, I'm going to talk about history. There is what history actually is, right? Which is evaluation of political realities, knowing what happened in the past. To me, if you want to know what history really is, you need to look at primary sources. What are the speeches that people made? What were the debates that they had? What did they write? What actually happened? We say winners write the history books, right? But it's not like they just write it just to write it. They write the history books because they want to change your understanding of political and social reality, right? Winners write the history books, and they fill those history books with lies and propaganda. So let's look at what we could do with history. So we have what history actually is, which is learning to critically read, right? To critically think, to express yourself intelligently, to understand what somebody who's writing in the 1600s, what is he saying? What does this rant even mean, right? And I think as both a homeschooler and just an educated person, I think you probably agree, and I know that many of the readers would agree that if you just memorize a bunch of names and dates, you aren't learning history. You are actually distracting yourself from the study of history. You are cramming your mind with distracting minutia rather than actually learning the actual subject. If you ask, you do a Google search right now, ask any kid in the whole world, or ask yourself to complete this, maybe not you because you were homeschooled, but if you were not homeschooled, you can ask yourself to finish this sentence, and it's always the same. History is, and if you don't believe me, ask Google, and that last word is always boring. History is boring. But how could the shape of reality, how could the debates that created culture, how could rhetoric and all this be boring? It's not boring. Memorizing nonsense, minutia, and propaganda is boring because it's stupid. Your brain recoils at the idea of it because instinctively you know it's the wrong thing. Instinctively you know, like, this feels stupid because it is. Because it is. Now, an amazing thing happened a few years ago between the other head of Vohra Method, Chelsea Snyder, and myself. We were talking about teaching AP history, just sharing. We discussed, we discuss our students behind their back, not maliciously, but because we want to make sure we're getting everything, have each other's insights, all that kind of stuff. And we started to realize that I just happened to be working with a lot of kids who were studying AP European history that year, and she was working with a lot of kids who were doing AP US history that year, and we were teaching the exact same stuff. We were teaching the exact same skills to both. And now I was like, whoa, what happened over here? So we started looking at the AP history tests. We looked at all 6 of them, and we realized something truly incredible, which is that they are testing the same skill. It's not a skill that's taught in school, because it's not just memorizing names and dates and idiocy. It's critical reading primarily. And yeah, it's a multiple choice test, and I know a lot of people have major issues with multiple choice tests, and that's fine. I mean, if you don't like
I love them. You never have to study for a multiple choice test.
What's that say, Ocha?
I said, I love them. You never have to study for them.
Yeah,
it's like you pick up random knowledge along the way that you can always answer a multiple choice test correctly without ever having to study. It's great.
And that's the thing right there. Everybody hates multiple choice tests until they're given the option of, like, an oral examination or a written essay exam. They're like, oh, so let's talk about what that allows, right? So if all these tests, so what we realize is this: we realize that 3 of the AP history tests are essentially content free, which means that you don't need any external content knowledge at all, which to me is good. I mean, that's what history is. History is, can you critically analyze a document? Can you understand a political cartoon? Can you understand a speech? And can you read into it and make some sense of it, right? And so we realized that 3 of the tests right there required no external knowledge at all. And then the other three, well, it depends actually. Chelsea says that there's four that require no external knowledge. I've argued that one of them requires a small amount of external knowledge, the amount that the average human being already has, but technically still external knowledge. So between 3 and 4 require no external knowledge. And the other two two or three require some external knowledge, but nowhere near the level of minutia that you waste your time with in public school or private school or boarding school or any of that. So what that enables is to create an integrated approach, right? What that lets you do is to learn the actual skills being tested, which are good skills. Now I know that a lot of, and by the way, just to set the record straight on one thing, there is this idea that's come from, I don't know where, that the SAT subject test and the APs are run by the government. They're not. They're run by College Board. It's a private company with competitors. Does it get crony capitalism? Yes, because almost every big company in the world gets crony capitalism. Do I support that? No, I think it's terrible. But I mean, McDonald's gets crony capitalism. Chick-fil-A gets crony capitalism. Everybody gets crony capitalism. And I want it to stop, but that doesn't mean that McDonald's is run by the government or that Chick-fil-A is run by the government. There is this, and they are private companies with flaws that I would love to see change, certainly. So imagine what that would let you do. You could, with a single training, get yourself ready for 3 or 4 or even 6 AP history exams in a single year. And no public or private school will let you do that. I'm not saying they won't help you do it. I'm saying they will actively stop you from doing it. They will say that you can't do it. They'll threaten to. We've had students that have been threatened with all kinds of things. From private schools, they're paying to go there. They're literally paying somebody to reduce their potential, right? They will do everything they can to stop you from doing this. And it's most dramatic, of course, in history. And you and I, of course, know why they would stop it in history the most. But, and I bet a lot of people watching probably figured it out too. But I'm going to say it anyway. Because it needs to be said. They don't let you do it in history because the less time they spend with you in history class, the less they can force their propaganda down your throat. Technically, you can use a physics class for propaganda. I mean, it would be weird, but you could do it. But anyone can use history for propaganda. I mean, history is the most best suited to brainwash people in the world. It's the ultimate tool for that. And if you tell a school, whether it's a public school or a private school, that no, we're taking away your brainwashing, they have a heart attack. They're like, no, take away something else. Take away this. Hey, here's a soccer field. Take that. Take our art center. Take our whole building. We'll just work outside, but don't take away our propaganda. Please do not take away that propaganda. And that's
in a lot of cases, they've switched it to cultural studies instead of it being history. So
no doubt, yeah.
Propaganda added into it.
It's like they're not even pretending anymore. They're like, yep, it's propaganda class time. They're not going to even pretend. Now, here's the thing. One of the truly bizarre things that we've seen, and this shows you the level of potential here, right? Is a lot of our students end up, a lot of the students at Vohra Method end up doing this, which is they'll add, 1 or 2 or sometimes even 3 AP exams towards the end of the year, right? And we'll do practice tests, we'll do practice sections. And what do we see every year? Let's say a student's been in an AP US history class, just for example, right? And so they know a decent amount of, or some AP US history, right? Or they know some US history, right? And then they add in, say, in April, an AP European history. What we see every single time, is that they just do better on the one that they didn't prepare for. They do better on the one that they didn't have the class for. And you might say it's the excitement, it's the nerves and all that, but it's actually not that. We've actually watched very closely, and I've discussed with students what's actually happening in their brains as they're doing this, right? So one of the things that you'll see on all 6 AP history exams and both AP English exams. So when I said you could do 6 exams in a single year, I should have said 8 because you can also add the 2 AP English exams. And just to put this in perspective, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with AP exams at all, AP exams at many colleges give you college credit. If you go in with 25 AP exams, that could be 2 years of college, adding more importantly, 2 years of college tuition. So, I mean, we're talking about a program that could save you between 60 grand and 120 grand. And the program is free, by the way. And I know that I'm pretty sure I forgot to mention that our website, by the way, is aphomeschool.com. It's step by step step-by-step free guide on literally how to exactly do this. Because I know a lot of times you and I have these abstract discussions like, here's what you need to do, and someone's like, but bro, like what book am I supposed to get? So the what book am I supposed to get? All of those questions, what video should I watch next? It's all right there. We have literally mapped out, do this, do this, do this. Now, some of you guys who are watching right now are all renegades. Yes, you can break every single one of those rules and it'll still work. But if you want a guide, to rail against and ignore and tell everyone is not as good as what you yourself did, the free guide is at aphomeschool.com. And if you just want a guide for normal reasons, like you just want to know what to do, it's also at aphomeschool.com. So we're talking about literally 8 exams in a single year on just the humanities. We haven't talked about science, just the humanities. We could do this, right? And it's all about learning skills that are not taught in school. See, we always talk about education being this, they want to make useful factory workers, but they don't want to accidentally produce revolutionaries, right?
Right.
And in history, that's the trickiest area because, yeah, of course you could teach people to critically read and think about history and think about, where does political power come from and what power is just and what power is not. Of course you could do that. And the last time somebody did that in America, a bunch of, people in their teens and 20s overthrew the government. I mean, that was the Declaration of Independence, and they're not looking to do that repeat itself. So they want to teach you a little bit. But they're like, oh my God, not too much. Here's the thing. You yourself can teach yourself the most. You, presumably, aren't going to try to censor your own knowledge. You're not going to try to make yourself dumber, right? You're going to try to build this to the maximum level. Now, if that turns you into a revolutionary, so be it. Then you're a revolutionary, but you're a revolutionary that's gotten a whole stack of 5s in their AP exams and saved over $100,000 in your college tuition. So let's start with that idea. So this single thing, and here's what this lets you do. It lets you dramatically separate yourself from anything happening in public or private schools. Like they can't get close to that because first they won't do it because it just attacks their reason for existence. And they're not used to thinking in a goal-oriented way. So even if they tried to do it, they would mess it up. What you want to do, what I want you to do, those of you guys who are watching, what I want you to do in your education is I want you to stop thinking of it as a daily chore. Forget the input. Bill Gates once said that measuring production of, I'm paraphrasing here, that measuring the progress of a bit of software by the number of lines of code would be like measuring the progress of building an airplane by weight. You don't want a heavy airplane falling out of the sky. And you don't want a 5 billion line of code that the most fastest computer in the world can barely handle. Measuring education by hours of input is exactly the same level of dumb. It's the same thing. You measure everything in the world in output already. You do this instinctively because it's normal. It's a normal thing to do. Now what I want you to do is to do that with your education and say, what are the things that I can achieve? Now we've had students that kind of start to think of it almost like a merit badge, right? They're just like, man, I got to get a whole pile of these AP exams. And that, to me, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. You say like, listen, I learned this one subject. I want to learn some more subjects. And here's the amazing thing when you do it independently, right? When you go to any public or private school at the end of the year, which you would have also witnessed for that 1 year of torture that, oh my God, the poor 1 year of torture, the rest of us who had the 12-year sentence.
Well, when you have to endure it every day, you don't realize it's torture. It's when you've been free for a few years and then you get tossed in there, then you're just like, wow, this is brutal.
So everyone right now serving a life sentence in prison, whatever she is.
It's bad.
I know what you mean. If you're so accustomed to it, if you didn't know, it's that famous, potentially apocryphal, potentially real quote from Harriet Tubman, I freed 1,000 slaves. I would have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. And you're right. If you don't know you're in jail, it's bearable, right?
Exactly.
But you knew. So yeah, I mean, that 1 year of torture was certainly in a lot of ways probably was psychologically worse. But the rest of us had to deal with 12 years of it. It's only like medium.
Luckily, my mom took pity on me and let me escape after 1 year.
Oh, thank God.
I had pity.
Oh my God, even I can breathe a sigh of relief. All right, so here's the thing that's so important here, right? Which is what you see at the end of the year at every public and private school. Because a lot of people say, well, are AP exams really learning? No, they're a way to indicate that you've learned some stuff. They're not. That's all they are. And if you do it independently, it's a way to show employers that you can work independently, and of course in a work from home environment, which is the entire future from now till forever. It's a good skill to be able to show. But here's the thing that you see at the end of the year at every single public and private school that I've ever heard of, ever been at, ever had a student at, is, oh my God, I'm so glad this year's over so I can forget all that stuff. I'm so glad I put in this year of effort so I can now throw it out the window.
It's a waste of childhood.
With that?
It's a waste of childhood.
It is. It's a waste
Make them sit there and just regurgitate stuff for a year that they have no intention of remembering. Once they get past the basic math and reading skills, everything else is just in one ear and out the other for the most part.
True, except for also, trust me on this one, a lot of the basic math reading skills are also in one.
That's why I said, well, yes, but I mean, even for most of the smart kids, the ones that can grasp the reading and math,
sure.
They still, most of the other stuff they learn in school, it's gone within 2 years from the time they learn it. So did they really learn anything, or did they just learn how to put stuff on a test?
Exactly. And here's the amazing thing about history. And people say, like, but Arvin, everything you just said is still boring. It's still boring. Maybe it's independent, and maybe I can get, save, $100,000 doing it, and maybe I get more prestige, and maybe I'll get a whole pile of awards. And by the way, we've listed the different awards. If those of you guys who really like awards, we listed them on the AP Homeschool website, so you can see what they are and how to get them and all that. But ultimately, it still feels kind of boring. And the reason that it's boring is all the cool stuff, all the exciting stuff, I should say, maybe not cool, but all the exciting stuff in history has been so censored or presented weirdly to you guys that you guys don't even know that it happened. So I don't know if you had this experience being homeschooled, but I'll tell you what happens to those of us in public and private schools. Even to this day, I actually checked with my before this presentation, I checked with my own the students who were taking AP US history about their experiences in public and private schools. Here's one of the things that they taught us and still teach kids today, which was that Abraham Lincoln, here's what he did, suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And everyone's like, yeah, I guess he did. Sure, why not? Most people remember it, and so it's weird enough sounding that most people get it right on the test. But when I've asked students, I'm like, well, do you understand that there was a vote that was about to happen, and he took the people who were going to vote to leave and locked them up so they couldn't vote? People are like, what? I had no idea it was that. I thought he just suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which to me sounds like he took a Latin class or something. He did. I mean, it's such a mind-blowing thing because, I mean, actual history, for better or worse, is just more interesting than, cleaned up history.
That's a lot of a weird thing I noticed was my mom, when I was young, had this addiction to old libraries, right? Like their book sales, yada, yada, yada. So we had biographies that were written anytime from like the early 1900s up through more current ones as they were filtering out one set of propaganda and putting in another. So if you could get like a biography of George Washington, for instance, we had one that was printed, I think it was like original 1930 something, and then we had some from the 1960s and 80s, and then the modern ones. And the story of George Washington is almost completely different based on which era of propaganda it is. And it's something that you would think would be pretty consistent across, same person, should be same story, but it's not. And it's weird just how much people have let that information just get completely bastardized. Sorry is this a family program? Anyway, just by the printing press, and then they just flush them out of
real education is not about censoring. Real education is about being real. So yeah.
Right.
And so in that zone, right, in that frame, here's what that lets us start to think about. That the history that you're not learning, it might be a little bit more interesting, and B, the only way to actually see what was actually happening is to look and read the stuff that came from that. George Washington was not silent for his entire life. He wrote a lot of things. He wrote this boring book about politeness. It says that you shouldn't be in a place half dressed. Dan Berman, I don't think would like that too much because of his notorious habit of being on podcasts where he's, top formal, bottom casual. I'm bottom semi-casual today. I'm not wearing shorts right now. Don't worry. But anyway, George Washington, he wrote a lot of things, right? And that you can find out who he was through his writings, through his speeches, and most of them have been passed down with little to no edits because they know that most people today just haven't developed the reading skills to read them, so there's no need to edit or actually read them. People are trusting what they get at school foolishly. I mean, adults are going to lie. And I'm not saying that you need to believe me more or less than anybody else. I'm saying look at the information yourself, see what happened, and verify everything you see. Just verify it, because who knows? I could be lying. Maybe I lied.
If you can't verify it, then say, okay, well, I've heard this, but I don't know it for sure because I can't verify it myself. People really look at you weird when you start answering their questions that way.
Like,
I can't verify it. I don't know.
Let me actually use the scientific method that's so talked about in schools, right?
Right. It's crazy.
Let's talk a little bit about math, and I think this is going to be an area where I think you and I will have more differences of perspective, which I think is going to be really cool for anybody watching. So one of the teachers at Vohra Method, it was more than one's been home, but one of the teachers at Vohra Method was both homeschooled and like really good at math, right? And the sense I get from you is you kind of fall in that same category. Homeschool, also good at math.
Now, I'm good compared to most Americans, not good enough to be an engineer.
Okay, gotcha. Now I want to address this thing because a lot of people said like, yeah, but like I'm worried about the math thing in homeschooling. And in fairness, I have met some people who are homeschooled and good at math. I met a lot of people who are homeschooled bad at math. And the people who are homeschooled bad at math are not idiots, and they're not lazy, and they're none of those things. But here's what I want to bring forth, and here's why I want you guys who are doing homeschooling to think of math a little bit differently than some of the other subjects. And here's why. Every civilization in human history has had some form of literature. Every ancient civilization had a form of arithmetic. Every civilization had some form of engineering and medicine and a lot of these other subjects, some form of science, right? But even if you use the most broad technical sense of algebra, like you're saying, like this technically counts as algebra, even though it doesn't look at it like it anyway, only a couple of the ancient civilizations had anything that you could classify as algebra. A lot of us learn in school the Pythagorean theorem, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared with the sides of a right triangle and the hypotenuse.
Yeah, you use it to calculate your measurements when building cross fencing.
Exactly. You can totally use it. So a lot of us memorize it like that, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. That's the Pythagorean theorem. But Pythagoras himself couldn't have thought of it like that because the Greeks didn't have that kind of algebra.
Right.
The way the Pythagorean theorem was originally expressed was that if you take the literal area of a square drawn on one side of a right triangle, plus the literal area of a square drawn on the other leg of a triangle, those areas added up would add up to the area of a square drawn on the hypotenuse of the triangle. Because you could have said a to the second, because they didn't have, that wasn't a notation that existed then, right? And the reason that this is important, and this is so vital to understand, algebra is not natural. Arithmetic's natural. So you leave somebody alone for long enough, they'll figure out some system of arithmetic. History is natural. Literature is natural. These are all.
I think algebra, the language we use to represent algebra is like learning any other language, but algebra very much is natural. If you build things, if you do any kind of canning, cooking, stuff of that nature, you start calculating volume, you start calculating square footage. Algebra covers all of that. Geometry covers that. So even though the notations are a language that's relatively new, the concept behind it is very old. Just look at any of those, what you were calling engineers and builders and all those things throughout history. Those people were using those same concepts. They just didn't have the language to note it the way we do.
Exactly.
It's the same idea, just different language.
And so I want to talk about when that language, which when we say algebra is unnatural, what do we mean? I mean, algebra, a lot of it's arithmetic. Arithmetic is very natural. A lot of algebra is going to be very natural. But when we talk about that language was created by Rene Descartes in the 1600s. That wasn't created. I mean, people say, well, algebra was invented, by the ancient era. Technically true. The father of algebra, Al-Khwarizmi, was thousands of years ago. But he didn't write what we call algebra, right? He wrote it differently. He wrote it in sentences and whatnot. And that's actually something we've drawn a lot from in Vohra Method, ways of teaching math and whatnot. But the modern notation that was invented by Rene Descartes. I mean, that's a very recent thing. And the reason that I bring this up is I do believe that with math, with algebra, and everything that's based on algebra, this chemistry, physics, and all that, you need to be very intentional about it, right? You have to say, here is my plan to learn algebra. And that can still be an entirely independent thing. I'm not saying it needs to be anything else, but it has to be very intentional. You have to recognize when you're doing that. When you're studying history, when you get into it and get past some of the weird language, it's going to feel natural to you. When you study algebra, there will be times it's going to feel weird.
The reason why algebra feels so weird for most people is because they don't have that life skill foundation set where the algebra is explaining the experience. They're trying to figure it out as a new language without having ever experienced. It's like, it's easy to understand what an apple is if somebody's handing you an apple when they say apple. However, if you've never seen an apple, then the word apple means nothing. So if you're not used to actually doing things in life, like figuring out where you're going to meet between 2 points or how to build something, whatever, then you're not going to understand what that language even means. And of course, it's going to be confusing. You're trying to learn a bunch of symbols without any context for it.
And to use an example to illustrate exactly what you're saying. So in school I studied Latin, and Latin is a literary language, and I was 13, and the great Latin poets would get into ideas that, like, so the poet tells us this famous poem where he talks about this person he's in love with, and he talks about how, like, this person over here is pretty, but this other person over here is beautiful, like using the Latin things which have their own nuances and connotations, right?
Right.
And I'm like, 13, I'm just like, I don't know what the difference is. Those two are synonyms to me. Like, what are we talking about over here? What does this poem mean? Like, I could translate. I haven't said that one word translated this way, but I couldn't get it because I didn't have any of the life experiences that would have put it in any kind of context.
Exactly.
And just as Latin can be kind of literary, and that poses its advantages and challenges, algebra has that same thing. Which is, if you haven't been doing anything, you're neither building houses nor computer programming, it's going to be tricky. But that's okay for it to be tricky. Fine, let it be tricky. But
the thing is, it's so much easier to learn if you teach kids how the world is working as they're actually doing, instead of locking them up in a desk for 7 hours a day. If they're out there building a fence, for instance, they're going to understand how to calculate a triangle a lot faster than if they're just looking at symbols on a piece of paper.
And they understand why too, right? I mean, you understand, like, why to bother with a thing if you see what you're gonna do with it, right?
Right, but that's why throughout a lot of history, kids were mostly just either working side by side with family or being taught at home for their first 10 to 12 years. And then if they were going to school, they went to school at that point. They didn't start school at pre-K or kindergarten. They learned life first, and then they learned the explanations for life. And they were able to pick up a lot more knowledge a lot faster because it gave context to what it was they were trying to do. And that's been lost over the years.
There's something I want to add into that. So, but wait, the only moral of that thing wasn't so much that was basically this: if you're studying math and you are struggling with it, don't beat yourself up. It's normal to struggle with algebra. It's good. It's fine. It's okay. If you have questions about it, just email us and I'll just talk you off the ledge or whatever. It's that's the main point. But I do want to go to your point, which is actually a really important point, which is the idea of kids being essentially apprenticed to their family way of life. And a lot of people have asked, if you're homeschooling, then what about all the other stuff, right? Like, the extracurriculars, the internships, all that. Like, wouldn't you have a huge disadvantage because you wouldn't have the connections from your school together?
You would have a bigger advantage because you have time.
That is. I mean,
I started working at 8 because I had time to work. And I got my first actual desk job at 15 doing database management for a real estate broker. Nice. Because I knew how to use Access and I had time, and it's a huge advantage.
About the real estate broker, were their business hours usually like 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. or something, or was it more?
Well, mostly she was just taking these huge client lists and property lists and stuff and putting together the database, and then the other thing was doing the mail outs, and I would do the photos and the write-ups for the property listings. Okay, so I could do it anytime I wanted within hours that people actually wanted to be awake for most of the stuff I had to do. It was pretty flexible.
So if you're doing stuff that's more back end, you have some flexibility in time. But here's the thing: most internships are going to happen during business hours. In other words, where every other kid who's applying for an internship, and like, listen, I get that if your parents have a certain level of expertise in the area, you can work, learn stuff from them, and some stuff you can figure out on your own. But if you're like, listen, I want to learn about something that's outside of that through an internship type program, it's a really big advantage to be able to actually work during normal work hours. Not like, we get so many people who are saying, well, telling us that they want us to help them figure out how to get an internship, and they're like, yeah, I'm only free on the weekends. I'm like, no, companies only work on Sundays, except for
Exactly.
a church, if you want to call that a business, but not really. And so there's that's not a thing. So if you're not stuck there, if you're doing your own independent academic work, the idea isn't just that we now take 8 hours of school and make it 8 hours of independent academic work. It's a lot shorter. You don't need to do that many hours of academic work a day.
Plus, the advantage of homeschooling is that you get those hours where you can do like receptionist work or whatever, where you actually have some level of, I showed up and had a resume. So you don't have to take stupid internships. You can just take a job where you actually get paid. I mean, yeah, you're lower down the ladder, but you're not having to work for free. Like, internships to me are so cringy because people work 40, 50 hours a week and they don't get paid. And it's simply because their parents handicapped them to where they didn't have a resume going out there into the market and could actually fight for something better than an internship. All they have is classroom time.
I'm gonna tell you guys one of our secrets for so a lot of our students who after college are applying for investment banking jobs. And I'm not a huge fan of it. I mean, I was a math and economics major at Ivy League college. I chose that I didn't want to do investment banking. I did want to do education, so that was more important to do something useful than to move money around. But that's not going to say I'm going to tell anybody else about it. If you want to do investment banking, by all means. But let me tell you one thing. If you are applying for an investment banking job, one of our insider tips for doing that is on your resume. One of the big issues that people have with young people now and also for all of human history is that they're lazy. Because either for perception reasons or reality, that's how they're seen. If you have on there a job that shows you had to work hard, mowing lawns or showing up to an office or doing something that looks like it was hard, that right there gives you a huge advantage over people who had bank internships and whatnot, because everyone knows if you're in high school and you have a bank internship, you're basically doing nothing. It's not people outside of banking know that, but people inside of banking, they know it more because they're there. They see their high school intern doing nothing all day. So that is a bigger boost than any of the other types of things. Having a job that's hard in any way, construction, right? Anything that requires effort is going to make, they'll say okay, looks like you'll probably show up on time, and I can do a lot more with someone that shows up sober on time, that shows up not at all because they're drunk, or just shows up not at all for some other reason. And that's a huge thing. And you'll see across every major company and small company, and Vohra Method is no different from this, that there are very specific ways to make sure, using whatever combination of financial incentives or whatever, to make sure that people show up. It is a major thing. If you can show that they don't have to worry about that with you, that's really huge. I want to also talk about, people ask about.
We're kind of running on time.
What's that?
We're kind of running low on time.
Oh, we're running low on time. Okay, cool. Let me just wrap up.
Can you see Myra's question here?
No. Where would I see it?
Okay. It says, I'm a former homeschooling mom who is running for State House on a school choice platform against a public school educator running on a birth through college public education platform. What is the best way to introduce school choices without sounding like you're bashing public schools?
You have to bash public schools. They're terrible. I know the concern, right? Because if the second you bash public school, you're telling somebody that they're a bad parent. Okay, fine. And that means maybe you don't win this round, you win next round when those people wake up. I mean, it is in education, and this is something I tell all the Vohra Method teachers and remind myself fairly often, is the beginning of education is the truth. If you cannot commit to the truth, you can be a guy talking about math, but you can't be an educator, because education at the very basis has to be about the truth. And if public schools are terrible, and they are, and if there are better options out there, and there certainly are, then that is something that's incumbent on all of us to do. And listen, I get more blowback than anybody from bashing on public schools all the time. But at the same time, yeah, fine. You know what? In any given day, I might get 100 people yelling at me about public schools, and I get one email a day or one email a week saying, "Listen, I was totally about public schools, and now I'm ready to do homeschooling, and you found your website or whatever." That one email makes the other 570 more than worth it. And so that right there, I think it's, you can phrase it softer, but it's going to come through anyway. And I would say this: the most powerful tool at our disposal is to encourage people to opt out, to encourage people to find other options. One of the reasons that we made the AP Homeschool Project was that we wanted people to know that even if you're scared, and even if you're terrified, and even if you don't know anything else, you now have, inside of educational circles, what's regarded as kind of one of the most relentless, ruthless, brutal education companies in the world on your team. I mean, if we were lawyers, we would be like the big, mean, evil lawyer. I mean, we're on your side now.
What do you mean if we were lawyers?
No doubt, right? No doubt. So I would say this. You can take a positive tone of encouraging people to use homeschool. If you think it would be relevant, feel free to share our website, aphomeschool.com, if you think that would be useful. If you think something else, you can go in whatever direction. You can take the positive approach, and you can also take the negative approach, which is that having people stuck in government-run propaganda factories is bad. And the more we excuse it, the worse it's going to get. It's time for us to opt out. It's time for us to say, yeah, no more. We're not doing this anymore. We're taking education back. Every person on earth has the right and responsibility to succeed on their own terms, not to follow somebody else's nonsense. To quote the cliche, we're all born originals. Why should we let education, fake education, government education, turn us into copies? We can do so much more than that. And that's really why we built this website, which is aphomeschool.com, and right there's the guide if you want the guide, and if you just want a guide to rail against, it's there as well.